going on here. More than likely, she's having some kind of female issue. That's what's going on here. And really, there's a problem with this for her in that particular historical context, and it happens on several levels. And so that you understand, she's living under what we now refer to as the Old Testament law. This law doesn't really apply to us in particular like it did to them, but all the law is expected to be observed by these Jews in the early days. Well, let me just read to you a little bit of this law. In Luke chapter 15, verse 19, here's what it says. When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. Let me pause here and just say what this meant was that she was religiously or ceremonially unclean. That would prevent her from being around certain people, being around people. She couldn't go to the temple to worship God. Now Leviticus continues a little bit further down in verse 25. It really speaks to her issue. It says, if a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. And then it goes a little bit further. Every bed on which she lies, and all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity. And everything which she sits on shall be unclean, or in the uncleanness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. I bet you didn't know that was in the Bible, huh? Now, let me pause here and give you some instruction, because I know this throws out a lot of questions. Why in the world is this in here? And why don't we observe these things now? What's the big deal? Again, this is Old Testament law. It applied to the Old Testament saints who were part of Israel. And these laws were known as purity laws or cleansing laws. And the idea behind them was that it was to teach the people that God is holy and He is separate, and that people by and large are unclean because of who they are. And so there were a number of laws that talked about being clean versus unclean, and that you did not approach God and when you were unclean, to remind us that we don't deserve to be in God's presence because He is holy and He is just, but He provides the ways by which we can get into His presence. And so they were basically to teach us about living holy and separated lives. So this law is applicable and it is in effect when this woman is approaching Jesus. But you need to know what a horrible situation now that this law created for her in light of her situation, because she had this flow of blood, and that it continued not just for a time it would stop, but for 12 straight years it was happening to her. She was considered unclean. She couldn't touch anyone. They'd be unclean too. Do you know what this would create? Just the way that would just separate her from people. She wouldn't have been able to have a husband, because he would have been always ceremonially unclean. So she probably never married. The people, if they knew about her condition, couldn't be near her. If they went into her house because she had places to sit in a bed that she laid on. If they touched those things, or if she touched them, then she would make them unclean, which would prevent them from going to the temple unless they went through the cleansing ceremony. And so this woman was just isolated and was weak and physically, emotionally, and she was just disenfranchised all around. And yet here you find her in an unlikely situation. She is in the middle of a crowd. Remember, if she touches someone, they're unclean. But she didn't care. Because you now have a woman, because of her health condition, is so desperate for a cure. Trying to get to Jesus. Desperate for healing. How desperate is she? Well, if you look at verse 43 there toward the end, you're going to see how desperate she was. It says that though she had spent all of her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. So desperate to be healed, her entire livelihood, all the money that she could get, she spent it trying to get doctors to find a cure for her. In fact, she suffered as a result from the care of these physicians. You know, the Bible has, there are 4 Gospels. Sometimes they tell some of the same stories. In fact, in Mark's Gospel, there's the same telling of the story, and he sort of gives some details that Luke leaves out. Verse 26 of Mark 5 says this, that she suffered under many physicians. And she had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse under their care. You see, this woman, there's nothing wrong that she did, going after these physicians. She did like any of us would do. And I'm telling you, I would do the same thing. If my wife, and my kids had a disease that couldn't be cured, we would go to medical professionals and we would do everything that we could afford to try to get treatment to bring healing. It's a reminder to me, now we've got some doctors and nurses and other people that are in the medical profession. Thank you for what you do and thank you for your ministry. But they'll tell you that, they can't heal everything. God's gifted them, and He's given them an education and experience to allow many things to be treated by their care, but they can't treat everything. There are some things that they have to come down and say, we've done all that we can do, and I'm sorry. We can't help you any further. You're just going to have to trust God. Now, this woman, she did everything she could. She went to all the doctors she could until the money ran out. And somebody in here, maybe you've been through that, right? You've been to the experimental treatment centers and you tried to get help from those that are at the cutting edge of the healing profession, of the medical profession. And you may, as others have heard, come to the end of your rope and they say, you know what? We've done all that we can do for you. This woman's in that place. And she's desperately reaching out for a cure. And when you're in that place and they say, we've done all that we can do, who do you turn to? Well, you turn to the one you should have started turning to from the beginning. You turn to Jesus, amen? And you say, Jesus, help me, which is what this woman did. I mean, it took a lot for her, by the way, to get to where she was. Remember, she's got this physical condition. She's losing blood every day. She's probably anemic, which makes her weak. You got a crowd pressing in on Jesus, and they're all scrambling to be near Him. In the bigger span of the story, Jesus Himself has another man that comes to Him, a ruler of the synagogue. His name is Jairus, and he's pleading for help for his daughter, who's 12-year-old, is his only daughter, and he wants Jesus to come bring healing to her because she's going to die. So Jesus is making His way to them. The crowd's trying to get their piece of Jesus, and all she knows to do is to slip up quietly behind Him. In fact, verse 44 describes it. She's trying to be, anonymous here.